Welcome. Thank you for being here. The first thing I want to say is, as you can all tell, I'm not Patricia Moy. You saw that she was going to be the moderator for this session. She wasn't able to make it to the conference. My name is Marie Hardin. I'm president-elect of AEJMC, and I got to tell you, I'm so thrilled to be here because I think what we're going to be talking about today is incredibly important and exciting, and I know you're going to have awesome questions for this panel. I've got a whole lot myself, but I know I've got to share the questions with you, and I'm looking forward to doing that. So welcome to this panel. The first thing I want to do is I want to thank Camille Gamboa and Luke Manquez for organizing and sponsoring this session. They're with SAGE. We are recording this session, and that video recording will be shared. So I think you're going to find this a really valuable, highly interactive session. What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask these three highly seasoned science journalists to introduce themselves, and then we're going to move into discussion of some projects they've been working on and then move to your questions. But when you each introduce yourselves, I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about your background, but I also, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask you to just tell us very quickly about one story you're working on right now that you can just share with us.
Sure.
Okay? Francie.
Hi, I'm Francie. I'm a writer of Pacific Standard magazine. I cover sort of the intersections of science and social justice. So that means both studies that look at whether policies aimed at alleviating inequality or public health problems, if those work, and also sort of the other way around. So, how science is dealing with its own social justice issues within the community. I started actually by teaching science right after college, and then when I decided to go to journalism, I went to journalism school. My first few jobs were covering studies. I think a lot of science journalists start that way. So new paper comes out, you read it, you talk to the authors, you talk to other scientists in the field. And I just wanted to do something that sort of makes science and humanities a little bit more, and that's how I got interested in Pacific Standard. I don't know what else I'm working on.
Yeah, but I want to ask you very quickly. You worked at Live Science and you wrote for Popular Science too,
yes,
right?
Yes, that's right. Mm-hmm.
And a famous story that you did about Kim Kardashian.
So at the time I was at Popular Science, Kim Kardashian, I think she posted on her Instagram this really weird bloody facial she did. She sort of poked her face all over these needles and painted sort of serum on her face. Anyway, so I talked to dermatologists about whether this is actually expected to make you look younger. It is not. That's all.
Don't try that at home. Okay, one story that you're working on right now.
As you'll see, the story I picked for this to talk about here is about sort of what a lot of scientists want to have happen to alleged harassers, sort of at their schools and in their fields. And so another thing that I am curious about is sort of what happens to alleged harassers after their universities find them to have violated university policy with regards to harassment. So I'm curious about what happens to the federal funding. So I've been trying to figure out, basically I've been taking cases and FOIAing for emails between the school and the funding agency to see sort of, does the school tell the funding agency who tells whom what and when, and sort of how do they decide what happens to these grants?
Oh, very interesting. Sikhan.
Hey everybody, I'm Sikhan Akpan. I'm the digital science producer for the PBS NewsHour. Because I work for a national publication, I'm a bit of a generalist. I cover pretty much everything. In a former life, I was a scientist. I got my PhD in pathobiology and molecular medicine, which is a mouthful, from Columbia University. I transitioned into science journalism about 4 years ago. After completing the science communication program at the University of California, Santa Cruz.
Before that?
Yeah, before that, I was a scientist who studied drug treatments for stroke. Before that, I was a kid running around Georgia. Let's see. One story we're working on right now, we went to the National Fire Laboratory recently, which is a part of NIST. Where we lit some upholstered furniture on fire. to learn about how they build standards for not only furniture, but for sprinkler systems, both indoors and outdoors, essentially in a way to do an explainer piece about how people can protect their homes from both fires inside and also wildfires, which is in the news recently.
And CCON is also, if I understand correctly, on the board for the National Association of Science Writers.
Yep, that's right. I was elected to the board in 2016. I'm the co-chair of the governance committee, which helps decide the policies of the NASW. And I'm also the secretary-elect, so I will most likely be the upcoming secretary for NASW.
Very good. Thank you. Elizabeth.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Sjogren. I work for a news organization with an extraordinarily long name. It's called Reveal from the Center for Investigative Reporting. It's kind of a hybrid of both Reveal, which is a weekly radio show and podcast on hundreds of radio stations around the country. And then Center for Investigative Reporting is a long-lasting investigative journalism outfit based in the Bay Area in Emeryville, California. So that's who I work for. And before this, I worked for High Country News, which is a magazine and website in the West that covers Western issues, environment, and lots of other things, public lands. And then before that, I worked for National Public Radio, and I covered the environment for the national and then science desks. Before that, I worked for the Los Angeles Times, and I covered the White House and Congress and poverty from the Washington Bureau. And before that, I covered the fall of the Soviet Union for the LA Times and as a freelance reporter. So yeah, that's my background. And something I'm doing right now, I can't tell you because I'm an investigative reporter. And if I told you, I couldn't tell the cameraman, so that would be impossible. But I can tell you, actually, there is something I can tell you that we're doing right now because as I said, we have or maybe I didn't say, but we have a website and we also have a radio show and podcast. So there's a story I broke on our website earlier this year, and it was about the National Park Service and how they were treating a research project that had been long underway. And what I'm doing right now is turning that into a radio show for Reveal. So that's what I'm working on now, and I'll tell you more about this story when I come up next.
All right, fantastic. Okay, so we have a little background about these journalists. And so what I'm going to do before we launch into some questions is I'm going to ask each one to talk about this. You've seen this scrolling set of slides, and each slide has a sort of an image that relates to the journalist and a story that journalist chose to talk about. So what I want to do is, and Elizabeth, if you don't mind, we'll go ahead and start with you. Okay. And what each journalist is going to do is talk about the story and kind of how it developed, and share with you some detail about a story that they chose that they wanted to talk about today.
What I didn't tell you about my job right now is I'm particularly covering how science is faring in the Trump administration. So it's not kind of new scientific findings kind of journalism. It's all about how government and science are interacting these days. And it so happened that when I was at NPR, I did a story about this research that I thought was fascinating. It was about how a climate scientist was going to look at 118 national parks and see how much sea level rise to expect in the future, depending on how much greenhouse gas emissions we put into the atmosphere. So I was fascinated by this research and that she was doing it. So I did a piece, which is kind of unusual, just about the fact that she was doing this research. And so a few years later, I started to get really curious. Well, how's the research going? I checked in on her, and it was going fine, and things were swimming along. And she expected it to be out kind of in the late summer or fall of 2016. So, and we all know what happened in the fall of 2016. Things changed a little bit in our country, and the report never came out. And so I started asking questions, and just got stonewalled by the National Park Service. And so then, I did some sniffing around the internet and figured out that there was some monkey business going on. So I did some public records requests, both with the federal government and with the state government, because the researchers working on this data and this research were with a state university, the University of Colorado. You guys probably know this. If you work for state universities, your stuff is vulnerable to snoopy reporters like me. So anyway, so that's what I did. And I found out that I got the actual drafts of her report, which had been done for years, and you could see how the actually career officials at the National Park Service were crossing out every reference to humans causing climate change in the report. And you could tell that the scientists and some of the other scientists at the National Park Service were fighting back and saying, "What the? You can't do this," you know. And this is so that was happening, and you could see, you know, in the Word document, you know what I'm talking about. You know, you can see the crossouts. And what was interesting is that I had drafts going back for more than a year, and for the first year, there was none of this was going on in the editing. The text had been edited, as you might imagine, as people were working through to make the text more compelling, but they hadn't been crossing out whole references to scientific reports that were important. So anyway, I did a story about this. And there's a lot more that I've learned since then that we'll be able to reveal when the radio piece comes out.
Just a quick follow-up. You mentioned public records, and I'm just curious, you know, pre-2016, post-2016, any changes in the way the agencies are responding to your requests for public records? Just curious.
Well, just to let you know, I put in a Freedom of Information Act request with the federal government my first week of work at Reveal, which was in February, and I still have not gotten a response from the federal government. The only way I got these drafts was through the state government, which responded very quickly. So the federal government, at least in my experience, is completely stonewalling. I did get a response to a Freedom of Information Act request that I put in for my last job fairly recently, but it was completely inane. There was nothing very interesting in there. And there's a lot of suing going on as a result. We're suing about the situation, and other people are suing because other journalists are suing because, you know, the government is supposed to be able there are deadlines. They're supposed to show the people what's going on inside their government, and that's. I would not say that previous administrations were particularly speedy with Freedom of Information Act requests either. So it's not to say that this is a brand new thing. So.
Thank you. Seacon.
Yeah, so the piece that I wanted to highlight involves some reporting that we did this past January, but the project started in November. We knew that we wanted to go to Puerto Rico to do a follow-up story to Hurricane Maria, and I knew that I wanted to cover solar power in some way because there was, you know, tons of news and buzz around, like, this is the time for solar power in Puerto Rico, like, this is how we're going to prevent the next energy disaster. And whenever I hear a lot of buzz about an idea, I immediately want to call bullshit on that idea. I don't know if we can curse, but if solar power was this godsend, you would think that it would already be in place. So what we did was we embedded with some groups that were trying to mount this solar power revival or renaissance. But we also spoke to officials at PREPA, the energy authority down there, the Energy Commission. We embedded with the Army Corps of Engineers to see what is needed on the ground to actually build back the energy system. And essentially what we found was that the reason that the energy recovery was taking so long had to do mainly with the Stafford Act. I don't know if people know the Stafford Act, but essentially what it says is that after an emergency situation, you have to build back a system exactly the way it was before. And so Puerto Rico's energy system is ancient, right? It uses above ground poles. I mean, that's why the hurricane was such a huge disaster, is because you just literally had trees knocking over these poles, and that's all they had. Normally you would put energy wires underground. So what happened with the Stafford Act and the story that really stuck out to me from being down there revolved around this thing called Puerto Rico Special. So Puerto Rico Special is the conducting wire that they use in Puerto Rico. It isn't used anywhere else. The people we talked to said that it was about 20 to 30 years out of date. But because Puerto Rico needed to replace all of its conducting wire, that required a whole lot of manufacturing. And a lot of that manufacturing had to be outsourced outside of the United States because manufacturers in the US don't make it anymore. So one of the main reasons why the energy disaster took so long to recover from had to do with just making this outdated conducting wire that to build back a system that is prone to failing when a hurricane hits. I mean, I think aside from that, it was an amazing experience being down there just because, I mean, if you read a story about the disaster, you know, you want to relate to the situation, but you won't really be able to relate until you go down there and see what it's like to live without power for 4 to 5 months. I mean, what was really interesting was that you saw people adjusting their lives around living without power. You know, essentially, like, I don't know, it was just, it was very moving to see people living day to day without what is an essential resource in modern times. I don't know if that addresses.
Quick question for you, and that is, what was your, you know, as you look back, what was your biggest challenge in getting this story?
The biggest challenge was getting there and finding the right places to cover the story fully. So at NewsHour, we really tried to be balanced in our storytelling. So we wanted to talk to people who were on the ground installing their own solar microgrids. We wanted to talk to officials at PREPA. We wanted to talk to the Energy Commission. We wanted to, you know, work with the Army Corps, but we wanted them to give us like a genuine story about the recovery, because a lot of times when you work with government officials or you bend with government officials, they want to tell you like the rosiest story. And so a lot of it just involved, you know, like hanging out with guys. Like I felt like we got the most interesting details about the situation down there when we were just sort of like hanging out and the cameras were off. Yeah. And that actually turned into a story that we published while we were there in the field about a corruption scandal at PREPA. There were, I think it was like 25 workers were under investigation for bribery, and that came from some sources that we were working with.
And how long were you able to be down there?
We were down there for about a week and a half. Yeah.
Okay. All right, Francie.
All right. This story is about a movement among some scientists to strip awards and prestigious fellowships from scientists that have been alleged to have harassed others, often have already been sanctioned by the universities who've done their own investigations. I got to it actually because I saw sort of the hubbub around people were trying to get the National Academies of Sciences to do this, and BuzzFeed, which has done a lot of really good reporting on sexual harassment in science, had covered that. And so I don't know, I just sort of called up some of the voices in that BuzzFeed story to be like, what's going on with this? How do you feel about the National Academies' response? Sort of opened the conversation a bit bigger. And so that's when I learned that it's not just about the National Academies. People are thinking about this for other kinds of fellowships as well and other kinds of awards. So yes, you know, I just kept asking people, who else should I talk to? Who else should I talk to? And I ended up talking to a bunch of people, many of whom didn't want to speak on the record, which is fine. But yes, and then I put together this story. Coincidentally, something like 3 days later, you guys might have seen this story too, because it ended up actually in the New York Times, I think, at a herpetology meeting, which is the study of slithering things, so snakes and reptiles and turtles. Anyway, at a herpetology meeting, there was some hubbub. Someone was getting a Lifetime Achievement Award, something like that, and their slide shows sort of scantily clad female undergraduates, and so there was a lot of protest around that by the people at the conference, and in the end, the conference organizers, I think, took his award away from him. So to me, that showed that it is something that's sort of gathering steam in the community. Coincidentally, my friend is dating someone who was at the conference, so I heard from them that my story got passed around the conference, which is kind of nice to hear. So yeah, there's been a lot of really great reporting from BuzzFeed and from Science also about sexual harassment in science. And so I'm curious, I want to know what happens next. Now we know it happens. We know that it's not any better or worse than in other industries. So what does the community want to do about it?
Just a quick follow-up. I'm curious. Did you learn anything about academia that surprised you?
Oh, I'm sure I have it. I don't know if anything comes to mind right away.
We're an interesting industry, right? Is that the right way?
Well,
We have our own norms and values.
So I was a teaching assistant immediately after college in biochemistry lab, and so it's like, I was in the lab for a little while, and I loved my experience there. I really liked my lab mates. It is interesting and difficult to finally realize that in this place where I found a lot of belonging is right, just like other industries. There's some percentage of bad actors there too.
Thank you. All right, so we have an overview. Obviously, you've learned about these journalists. You've learned a little bit about one particular story that they chose. I'm sure they have lots of other stories that they can talk about. But what I want to do now is I've got a long list of my own questions, but you probably have already questions about what you've heard or things that you came to learn more about at this session. I know a lot of us in the room we have our own science journalism classes, perhaps. We're preparing young people to go into this field. This is important work, and you have your questions, and I welcome you at any point to just raise your hand and jump in with a question. I'm going to start with just kind of an overview question that relates to the title of the panel session, right? And that's so let me just throw this one out, and other folks can pull threads on this one. And that is, this is about science reporting in the Trump era. So how has your job changed in the past 20 months? Anybody?
Well, I can go. I have a new job, but I saw my old job change dramatically. So I wasn't just a science reporter, so maybe I'm a little bit different there. But I kind of saw the focus of my journalism from finding out, what cool things were going on to advance society, the environment, science in the West, and how government was making that happen or standing in the way of that happening. That was a big part of a lot of my stories. So one of my feature stories was about fires. And so the story included both what government was doing to help places deal with this kind of growing problem of fires. And there were lots of interesting things about that. In some ways, government was helping. In some ways, government was hurting. Another story was about the national parks and climate change and all the things that the government was doing positively and negatively. And then, I have to say, since this is in part due to the exact job that I have right now, but now all of my stories are negative. Like there's just not a positive story to do, and in my life. So that's a big change to just I find myself talking about my work much less at parties. Kind of a downer.
It does feel like a lot of science journalism is about the delight and wonder of discovery, and I think that is a great thing about it. It does feel like there was less appetite for that with the new administration. People were just like, oh, we're so worried about science funding, which has been pretty okay. But so yes, I see that across the industry. I'm hoping that that's coming back, that people now want to learn about science as a positive thing again, but I don't know.
I mean, I think with NewsHour, we're sort of like the original news aggregator, right? We're a news discussion show. So the biggest adjustment has just been dealing with the volume of news that's coming out. of Washington, finding new ways to cover tweets, because I mean that's not necessarily something that we would have done in the past, but because so much policy is being released through Twitter, I mean it's a sort of a thing that we have to do now. I think to some degree, that huge volume at times it can push other stories to the side, and I think science is sometimes the victim of that. But I mean, we found just in terms of numbers that our science content performs just as well as all of our other news. At times, it performs better than our political news. So I mean, I think there's still a hunger and thirst for science news, absolutely, especially when you look at agencies like the EPA and the Department of Interior, agencies that are really affecting our parks, affecting our water, affecting our air. Like people have a lot of interest in science-related stories on those topics.
Are there particular stories that you really love going after? As you think about what stories you either want to pitch or start following. Lots going on out there.
You mean from the sense of covering the Trump administration, or from the sense of covering science in general?
I'll take both.
Okay. I mean, I think in terms of covering the administration and just politics in general, I mean, there's so much news about the character of politicians right now. There's so much news about, Trump-related scandals of all sorts and varieties. But the key is to kind of find the stories that no one's really paying attention to. So, for instance, we're covering a story about the EPA this week related to a toxin that is sometimes found in building materials. The EPA put out a public commentary for this toxin, or for this issue, this new rule, a month ago, but it's really gone under the radar, and it's something that could really affect everyone. So I think it's just finding the stories that are more related to policy rather than to character. And then in terms of general science, man, I love covering general science. I mean, we just did a piece about open offices and how they are ruining everybody's lives. And, it did really well because I think people want, science to explain what's going on in their day-to-day.
A lot of people in this room, I'm sure, are science communication scholars, right? We're studying the process and sort of the best ways to communicate. I imagine in the Trump administration, in some ways it may be more different than previous administrations, but there's always been kind of a conflict of people's political values and science. And when those come together, we end up polarizing certain scientific topics. And we've all done, I think, a lot of research on ways that we might be able to try to mitigate that. As science journalists, how much attention do you pay to the research that comes out in science communication? Does it influence the way that you're writing about science? And if you don't have time or can't aggregate the information, what can we best do to help you guys write better as our on-the-ground counterparts in communicating science?
And can I just interject? Can you provide one example maybe of?
Yes. So we did a research study where we talked about how to write about Zika. And we found that if you combine Zika and just the health consequences and issues with issues like immigration or climate change, saying either one of those are going to exacerbate the problem and increase the prevalence of Zika in society, then you end up polarizing Zika. If you attach it to immigration, then you see people who are liberal downplay the concerns of Zika and also disagree with the likelihood that it causes microcephaly. We see the reverse if we combine Zika with climate change and talk about it as being an issue that is, as climate change gets worse, the Aedes aegypti mosquito will be able to live in these areas. So if you're concerned about Zika, you should be concerned about climate change. We find that then conservatives answer the way liberals did when we talk about immigration, where now they're not concerned about Zika anymore, and they don't believe in the causes and consequences that scientists are finding. So just as from reading a story, we can end up polarizing these issues. So we released this study, and we've still seen stories trickle in where Zika gets connected to either climate change or immigration or both. And so we get concerned that one of these topics that's important to talk about, although it tends to only come up around the summer, it could be polarized and become as polarized of an issue as either of those two. So how do we help maybe get that information to you guys quicker, or where do you go to collect that, or do you at all?
I don't know if there is a place where we would collect information on that. Pacific Standard does actually, we do cover studies about how people perceive climate change depending on how they read about it. But there is something called Journalist Resource, and I look at that sometimes. I don't know how often other journalists use it, but that is a webpage that brings together studies that can help journalists with their news coverage. So maybe that is the best place to do it. It's interesting. Your research sounds fascinating, and we are concerned, I would say, with how, with making sure that what we write in a way that when people read it, they're getting an accurate impression from it. And so I think a good parallel, there's been a lot of research about how to cover mass shootings in a way that is safe and effective, and I look at that a lot. On the other hand, it's hard. I don't know if it's how much it is our job to make sure people don't take things in a polarizing way. If immigration truly is a driver of Zika, or climate change truly is a driver of Zika, I feel like for journalism, it is our job to get that information out there. There are ways, of course, research back to present information so that it doesn't seem like scolding to people or shaming to people. But as long as if you presented something in like a open and gentle and true way, it's not in our hands how people take that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think our job is not to be the peacemaker for society, to try to, can't we all get along and all my journalism is going to be about trying to forge this divide that we have in society. I think we can't really do that. I think that our leading mission has to be truth. And if immigration is a big factor in Zika, or if climate change is a big factor in Zika, then we have to talk about it in as blunt of terms as possible. Our job is not to make things more comfortable for people. And so I just don't think so. This came up actually in a conversation I had with an editor yesterday, and I'm still stewing over it. The editor said, well, climate change is kind of it turns people off, so maybe we shouldn't talk about climate change in our story. And I was like, how can we not talk about climate change? It's such a big issue in science. It's not just an issue in she wasn't saying let's never talk about climate change. I don't want to exaggerate it. But it was the idea of somehow we're going to turn people off if we say, the fact that things are going to flood is related to climate change. Well, it's going to flood a lot more because of climate change, and that's the projection, and so you have to deal with it. But it's not just editors who wonder about this. We don't want to turn off listeners. It's also scientists. I can tell you that I got attacked for doing that story by a scientist, because the scientist was so angry that I drew attention to the fact that these good government officials were censoring the scientific report. He was angry about it because they're doing the best they can. It's a difficult situation. What's most important is that the data gets out, that it's described in a slightly inaccurate way. Doesn't really matter. So, I think that his point is that we live in a world of political realities, and we want to make sure the science keeps getting out, even if we have to sugarcoat it so that people keep spending money on our science. And a lot of scientists are doing that right now. They're making grant proposals and not mentioning climate change, even though their research is all about climate change. And I find that offensive. Like, I want people to be, I guess truth has always been my mantra. It's like what I care about most. And And that's what made me a journalist. And so I don't know. I mean, I think it's a really important conversation for journalists to be having together and for journalists in academia to be having together, because does truth matter? I don't know. If it doesn't, then...
But I mean, so following up on that, I think there is a difference between, like what you're saying, like sugarcoating studies and being concerned that the way that studies are framed might obscure the truth that you're trying to get out. So if you're trying to communicate about the causes, consequences, and the way that people should react to Zika, to what extent is it necessary to attach it to these other frames? And are those things different then? Are you sugarcoating it by just giving out a public health message about Zika?
No, I don't think you are. I don't think you are at all. And I think your research is fascinating. I'm not attacking your research at all.
I just wanted to differentiate.
But there's a question, like what do you want journalists to do with it? I think your research would be interesting just as a story. Isn't this curious that people believe in Zika when it fits the rest of their worldview, and when it doesn't, they're thinking, well, it's not so bad. I think that tells us a lot about us as a nation. So it's fascinating, but I don't know, and I think it's also it's just fascinating. But it sounds like what you're saying is that maybe because of that research, the stories that we do in the future about Zika shouldn't be about immigration or climate change, and that I think that would be the wrong takeaway. I think the takeaway from it should be just to be aware of the impact that it has. I don't know.
I agree with all of that. I mean, I think every reader is going to resonate with the story in a different way. I mean, I think if you connect Zika to climate change and it promotes a story in a certain group, and then if you connect Zika to immigration and it takes away from a certain group, there's nothing you can really do about that. Like we are here to tell stories that have as much context as possible. But I do agree that studies that show how stories are framed, like how they perform, is really interesting. I mean, NewsHour is currently conducting a study right now on that for video segments. I mean, one study that I remember a lot when I'm covering climate change is there was a study a while back showing that if you frame climate change in terms of how things used to be, and how it's sort of been changed to modern times versus like what climate change is going to do in the future, the first concept resonates better with conservatives or people who might not agree with climate change, and that's definitely something that I think about when I'm writing a story, and something maybe that I'm trying to incorporate. But I also try to incorporate all the other things that I would into a story about climate change.
Really quick, what would be helpful is we all know that one study doesn't tell us. So if there's someone or somewhere who can be like, this is sort of the consensus about what certain kinds of stories do, that would be helpful.
Great. Yes, question.
Yes, so I'm in a department that does a lot with the rhetoric of science. So there's a little bit of the peeking behind the curtain and how do scientists talk among themselves, and the process and the politicalization and the arguments that go on within there. Do you feel a responsibility to talk about that, or do you feel that creates a sense of uncertainty about science that's unnecessary?
What do you mean by can you explain again what the rhetoric of science is?
Looking at how they persuade one another. So like
how scientists persuade one another?
Both persuade one another and also outside public. So if you use the example of climate change, as you're saying, how they frame things, or the fact that within the scientific community there's arguments about the accuracy of the models, or like, no, that model doesn't work because you're excluding this, and things like that. So the argument within the scientific community has been taken up politically. So it muddies the water. I guess you could also say, is there a fair expectation that scientists should remain apolitical, and science is above politics? It's dealing only in truth, and that there isn't the sense of persuasion. I might be in the wrong room. Like I said, I come from a rhetoric program.
I think scientists, just like everyone else, have their biases, and it's important to highlight those in stories. So, I think if there's a consensus, we report on the consensus. And, if there are 3 people in a room who say that climate change isn't real, we mention that too. But then we also mention something like, if you had a gun that could hold 100 bullets and you had 97 bullets and you had 97 chambers that were full. Like, would you play Russian roulette with that gun? Like, you think you have to frame it in a way to sort of show that, there is a consensus, like scientists are moving in one direction, and even if there are people who speak against that consensus, you can include their voices too. But I think when you spell out the balance, like, people get it. We recently did a story about vaccines in Vermont, where we had, a doctor who had a child who had an immunodeficiency, and so she couldn't take vaccines, but she needed all the other kids in her school to be vaccinated in order for her not to, catch a disease that might kill her. And then you had a parent who said that she didn't want to put her kid in school because they're forcing her to vaccinate her child. And when you let them just sort of like lay out their arguments, the one that was pro-vaccination, I felt like kind of won through, and you could see how the rationale behind that sort of fits to serve a wider group of people versus the one that's anti-vaccination.
Just a quick follow-up. At what point do you stop feeling the need to report the fast dwindling other side of the argument, for lack of a better? What point do you make that decision that that's no longer a valid part of the reporting?
This is a really important question because it depends on what your job is. Like, if your job is as the science reporter to report on what is science, that's one thing. But I would hear a lot of kickback when I was at NPR about, why are you covering the deniers in Capitol Hill? Well, he's the chairman of the Senate Environment Committee, and what he says matters. So that's why you have to cover it. Like, it's not because it has an impact on policy, because it has an impact where we're going, because it slows down other things. Whatever it is, you don't stop covering it if they have power, because in fact you cover it more because you want to know, why do they have this position, and what can I learn about who their funders are and why it's important for them to do that, and how are they twisting the science because of their donors, if that's what it is, or whatever. You can't stop covering it if it's having an important impact on our society, I think.
I totally agree.
Yeah, I agree.
Microphone over here.
Yeah, actually, the question you just asked was what I was going to ask. So I'm going to try to pinpoint in on it just a little bit further. Something that I guess is a bit of a pet peeve of mine is that we often talk about science as a static thing, but science is a process. Science doesn't say anything. It's a process that helps us discover truth. And so this idea of scientific minorities that are very small is interesting because historically many of our current, scientific almost consensus started as tiny minorities. So I guess my question for you, and maybe since we talked about climate change a lot, going beyond climate change into other issues, GMOs, vaccines, when do you feel a responsibility to give the minorities a voice, not just because of the policy implications, because I get what you're saying, but because of the potential that minority won't always be a minority? Is there ever, just as part of supporting the scientific process, a responsibility there?
So sort of like covering emerging ideas.
Yeah, emerging ideas that are kind of anti-consensus, I guess.
I don't know. Does anybody else want to? I mean, I can explain what we do, but
Yeah, you should say.
I mean, normally we just straight out say this is a new idea. That there isn't a whole lot of information to back this up, and then I think the hope is that the audience understands that this could be wrong. This is a new idea. It could be completely false. I mean, you get a lot of reports that. A lot of scientific studies that get a lot of play in the news because of the journals that they come out in, and it is always important to say, like, we're not sure if this is real, or like getting a voice who says, like, this is very new and it's very controversial. And I think as long as you have that voice, you're good.
Other questions here? There we go.
Just to get back to this terminology question, totally agree with what you said about not shading your story so that you conform to people's preconceptions. But I live in the West, and I think This American Life did a piece about how differently people responded to a story that pointed to changes in agricultural conditions if it was framed as a function of drought than they did if it was climate change. And this is particularly about ranchers, that if you use the word climate change, they turned off and they didn't listen to you anymore. But if you talked about drought, that was a problem that they were dealing with, and it was something that they knew that their grandparents had dealt with, that it's a persistent problem. So just a question of whether you, and we do a lot of local journalism, if you use certain terminology in a red state, if you're going to turn off, whether you ever have that discussion about which terminology to use in a certain story.
Pacific Standard does not. We mention climate change if it's an important part of the story. That said, I mean, I could imagine you have to serve your audience too. Like, what is going to be actually most helpful to these ranchers? You know, if they understand what's happening to them as drought or climate change, especially local paper, like if that's your audience and that's who you're trying to help prepare for the future, with the truths that are happening around them, then there's an argument for that too, I think.
But I just wonder, how do you not say in a story about drought, also say that the predictions are that drought in this area are going to get a lot worse because the climate is changing and it's becoming hotter and drier? Like, I don't know. I mean, I guess it depends on what the story is. If it's about this drought, this year is this, maybe you can, or, you know, because I think agricultural practices are changing not just because of this year's drought, but because of projections that drought is going to get far worse, and that, you know, things like fire in a place like Montana fire is going to become much more a prevalent part of your world in Montana. So I don't know, if you're a journalist and you're covering that story and you don't mention that, is that okay?
I think there was a Pew study that came out this spring that showed that most Americans believe climate change is affecting them or their local communities in some way. So, I mean, the benefit of working in television is that a lot of times you let people tell their own stories. So I imagine that, you know, if we did a climate change story in Florida, you know, they would tell it in terms of sea level rise. If we did a story in Mexico right now, they would tell it in terms of drought. If we did one in California, they would tell it in terms of wildfires. I mean, I think finding characters who could kind of explain their own story and then giving the broader context is a good way to handle that. It's also okay to mention climate change, even if it's going to piss somebody off. I mean, I think a lot of, you know, some of my stories that have done the best have been ones that really make people mad. And, you know, we find, like, the engagement, the views, like, they're just as high as any of our other pieces, just because. I mean, there's no such thing as a bad click, I guess. I don't know. Or a hate click is still a good click. I don't know.
We've got a question right up here at the front, so we'll get I'm sorry,
that's
and then
okay.
we'll come over to you. Okay, go ahead.
Hi, so I wanted to ask, like a lot of people in here, I also teach journalism, and so teaching especially classes based around like data journalism and investigative journalism. So I wanted to hear from you guys, you know, you're having interns come in or having new journalists come into the places that you're working in, and particularly in this era, you know, sort of what this panel is organized around, when truth or data sources themselves can be, in fact, you know, seems maybe more contested. You know, what is something that we can do to help prepare the journalists that are going to be, you know, coming into your newsrooms or working with you guys as well? Like, what else can we do to help prepare them to be successful in writing about science and in writing about, you know, producing science journalism pieces? Like, what are things that we can do that you wish the people that were coming into your newsrooms were sort of more prepared for?
Yeah, I mean, we work with a fair number of news assistants who are early career journalists or, you know, straight out of undergraduate. I was just talking to a news assistant yesterday about how it's important to, you know, eliminate any bias that you might be carrying into a story. I mean, I think there's a lot of there are a lot of news outlets right now that are kind of speaking to one side or the other. which I think can be a little bit detrimental to an early career journalist. I mean, I think it's, what I told her is that, and this is something that we pull from research, is that, it's important to prove yourself wrong before you prove yourself right. If you have a strong idea about how you think a story might be going or might be framed, or you have a strong preconception, it's important to make sure that you're trying to find the sources who could tell you otherwise, and then if they agree with you, then that's perfect. But full speed ahead. But it's good to remove your biases if you can.
Do you see that a lot with young journalists coming in that you're dealing with, that they sort of bring biases overtly into the kind of work they're doing?
I mean, I don't want to say that the young journalists that I work with doing that, like across the board. But I think at times, they have, they're like, I want to write that viral Huffington Post piece. It's gonna completely slay. And you just have to pull them back a little bit and say, like, look at the bigger picture.
I want to make a plug for data journalism, because if you're teaching journalists these days, they're digital natives. Like they get it so much more quickly than than probably you do, or than I do, or the people they're going to join in the newsroom. And they can make themselves, and yet I've heard we have a data team, and I don't know this myself, but I've heard very recently from them that often journalism students come out of their journalism schools and don't have the basic skills in how to make spreadsheets and do analyses that you can teach them there at school, and then they can make themselves valuable from day one. And there are a lot of other things that are important in presenting the news, where having computer skills can make them all the more valuable. That's not to say that the other important things about how to make a nut graph and figure out, what is my story about, like those are really, really essential. But I think maybe it's a problem that a lot of the people who are teaching journalism schools aren't actually digital natives themselves and don't really understand the way to use data. But it's really important, because more data is available, and in science it's really usually important. And so anyway.
Francie, do you want to add anything to the answer to this question about what do we need to be focusing on with our journalism students?
Yeah, I don't supervise the new fellows or interns at Pacific Standard, so I'm not as intimately aware of their work. But I actually feel like they're prepared. Like they seem, as I've noticed, a lot of them do come in with digital skills. We had someone build a bot for us in Slack, which was really helpful. That's really great. And that is incredibly helpful to newsrooms. Our newsroom is pretty young, but even so, like there are a lot of things that we'd love to see people come in with digital skills.
I'd make one side comment about digital natives, is that I feel like at times they have this tendency to pull in content from like around the web, like stuff that they're seeing, instead of like, getting on the phone and making phone calls and interviewing people. So that would be one thing that I would tell a young journalist is like, really try to find the story on your own.
I'm curious about how you consider funding when you're writing a story, when you're writing about research in particular. Like, do you always, usually never, whatever, like check out, well, who funded this research? Who's behind it? Is there any possibility of taint or, that kind of thing? And even in addition to that, if you find the funding, but there's no sign of any hanky-panky, do you still mention it, or when you judge it to be okay, you just don't mention it, but if you think it's funny, then you mention it? Like, how do you handle who funded the research?
I can take that. I really don't have, I'm not a normal science journalist, so if there was a connection with the funding, it would probably be hanky-panky, and I would probably write it or question, like just to let people know this study was funded by, it comes up a lot when covering the EPA. This study was funded by the chemical company that wants EPA not to regulate them. So it would often end up being part of the story. But I guess if there's no, I mean, it depends if this, how big of a piece of the story it is.
Actually, let me, because that would be an obvious one, right? Like this is about a chemical and the EPA approving it or not and the chemical company. But what about things that, I'm thinking in the era of Trump, maybe things that used to be funded and now they're not getting funding? Or, you know, the funding is shifting, maybe. I'm just wondering how much do you look at that when you report about any kind of new research or any new study?
I get what you're saying. I think the problem is that if you're covering one study, it should be a short story. You shouldn't spend a whole lot of words on one study. That what does it mean for an overall thing anyway? And so I do look at the funding if it's in the study. Like, so I'll look up who's funded it, but almost never mention it. Yeah, I would need some pretty strong evidence of hanky-panky to mention it. I think it's a really important issue, but I think, yeah, if you're writing a short story about one study, the time it would take for you to really vet out the funding, because, you know, like, studies are funded by industries, and that fact alone doesn't mean there's anything wrong with the research. It would take a lot of effort to figure out if something did happen, and so, yeah, for a one study story, if it really seemed kind of sketchy to me, well, the thing is, if you're covering a study, you should also send that study to outside scientists in the field, and that is really where the vetting goes on. And, you know, I've definitely, it sucks, but I've often not covered studies when an outside scientist is like, no, it's not really that great of a study, then I won't cover it at all, versus like covering it and saying that. I mean, I don't know if I make the best choices with
I think
regard to this.
the funding and the defunding of science is an enormous story on its own.
Right.
And so doing a story about one study and who funded it, if the main reason is just reporting the study, that maybe is not where this question lies. I think that what you're suggesting is in fact true, that there needs to be a lot more scrutiny of just that whole idea and what happened to the funding of this really important kind of science that we're not funding anymore. That might be a really important story to do. It's actually, I'm looking for stories like that. So if you have ideas, let me know, because like federal funding is drying up, but also it's not just federal funding. Other funding might be drying up, and that might be the story. In fact, who's getting rid of that funding? Lots of universities are deciding they don't really want that person to be doing research anymore because it's getting too close to one of our funders, and we don't want that to happen. To me, that's fascinating. It tells us about our academic institutions, and I want to know more about that. If I don't get to do it, I want some other reporter out there digging that out.
Question right behind. Yeah.
Hi. So I do some science journalism, and a lot of the people that I work with have a huge fear of hype. They're always concerned that if they write too much about a new idea that might be a breakthrough, but it also might turn out to be nothing, like it's better not to cover it. And I feel like we talked about that a little bit earlier, like when you were talking about looking at the scientific process, because I think that as scientists, we realize that the scientific process, like you can't ignore it, but does the general public understand that like sometimes you get things right and other times you're not on the right track? So I guess, do you have any advice for trying to like balance the hardcore science and science process, but like not making it seem really hyped up and like something that it might not be? I guess like presenting it truthfully. That was a weird question. I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think hype is a huge issue, not only with science journalism, but journalism in general, because I mean, I feel like you have these like huge groups like NASA who like, I love NASA for the record, but they'll do this thing where they really hype a study that's coming out, and you're like, oh, this is, when you look at the nuts and bolts, you're like, this is a very like marginal increase in like the knowledge, but you know, they'll like hint at the press release like 3 days before they release it, and then they'll release it, and they'll do like this huge publicity rollout. It's, I don't know, it's really hard. I think it's hard also because of how news is presented in digital outlets, like in terms of, you know, Google News Trends, Facebook News Trends, like these things are kind of built to create hype and also kind of reinforce hype. I think again it comes down to telling really balanced stories and hoping that people realize that just because NASA has found a large reservoir of water on the southern pole of Mars doesn't necessarily mean there's life in there. It's like really making sure that it has all the context that people need to make good judgments about the story. But it's a huge issue. I think about it all the time. It bothers me. Excuse me.
Yeah, I agree.
Another question, yes.
Kind of to go off of that last question, have you noticed any changes in your coverage of science due to the rise of social media giving voice to people with very anti-scientific viewpoints? For example, the anti-vaxxers, or I just recently discovered the Earth may be flat. And has that impacted the way you cover science in any way?
Haven't those people always been out there? I mean, you can hear them a little bit more now, but I think a lot of the points we've already made about covering fringe ideas when they could have power, covering emerging ideas with the sufficient context around what this means for the field and how it compares to how other people believe in the field, those all would apply.
Yeah, I mean, we did a story about flat earthers after the rapper B.O.B. Went on his little social media tirade about it. And that was, for me, was like the one story that we're gonna do about it. I mean, I think there was this trend of like, going to flat earther communities and like really trying to get it, like, why do you believe that the earth is flat? And I think in some ways it promotes those ideas. And if it's a situation where we know the earth is round, I don't see a whole lot of benefit in providing a platform for flat earthers, unless you are
Unless they're the president of the United States or something.
Yeah, exactly. And then I think, and if that happens, then your story is about why this isn't true. I'm pretty sure.
How do you all what's the most usefulness you find in social media? Maybe you're on Twitter or whatever. How do you use it? How do you find it useful?
Well, it's another way to publicize your journalism, which is nice, to try to push your story out, and you can find other people will push it out for you once you're on there, so that's good. So you reach audiences that you might not normally reach. I think that's a great way for social media to help journalism.
Does it help you at all with sources or no?
Yeah, I find it to be I find Twitter to be an extremely useful tool for sourcing, especially when you have an event like Kilauea or an event like the Guatemala volcano disaster. You have these really interesting subcultures on Twitter where you have experts just kind of like discussing what's going on, and if you can find them, they tend to be very good for finding people for stories. It's the main one. Yeah.
It can be helpful to find people like patients that are affected by a particular disease or issue. Those people often have support groups online, and you can find them through there. The caveat then is that I also cover a lot of drug addiction, and I've seen studies. The people who are online talking about the drug use tend to be young men. So you're missing, you have to know that you're missing some people when you recruit sources that way.
Okay, question.
I have two questions, if you bear with me. One specifically for Francie, one for all of our wonderful panelists. For Francie, I'm wondering, with the talking about stripping of the honors and the Me Too and the sexual harassment, have you found any concerns about doxing both of the people making the accusation and the person being accused? Do you know what I mean when I say doxing?
Yeah, this is a really good question. I actually haven't covered any. I haven't been the one to break the news of accusations, so that hasn't been relevant to my work. But yeah, I mean that's a good question. The people I have spoken to have been very happy to be on the record, and I don't think are at risk for doxing. I actually don't know what I would do if I'd have to sit down and think about it.
Well, not for you to dox, but that for people then to be like, for example, that one who had the scantily clad people. There could be the social media campaign to dox him, so he gets fired.
Yeah. that, yeah, it hasn't come up yet in the stories I've done. If it did, I would have to sit down and think about it or know
Okay.
exactly how to handle it.
My general question is referring to sources. There's the old stereotype of the scientist is an older white male with glasses, wearing a lab coat, and maybe bald or wild Einstein hair. But representation matters. So do you feel a responsibility to try to have diversity in your sources, both ethnicity, gender, and racial?
Yeah, for
Yeah,
sure.
absolutely. Yeah.
There's some great online resources out there for finding scientists who are doing good work in their field but may not be as famous as other ones. And I can't bring them to mind right now. But
Yeah, Diverse Voices, Sciline is a new program from AAAS, and they have like a whole separate segment that's just sort of like a diversity initiative. Yeah, I mean, I think it's something that we have to be actively thinking about. I know some journalists, will ask like, "Hey, can you give me an expert, who's a woman? Can you give me an expert who is a person of color?" A lot of times, I ask, if I'm talking to one scientist, like, "Hey, can you give me like 4 other people to talk to?" And if 3 of them are dudes and 1 is a woman, I'll pick the woman. I think it's something that we have to be actively engaged in doing, because there is this history of it being slanted in one direction for so long.
I think there's another side of this, though, and I find it frustrating sometimes because it's something I prioritize. It's very important to me that I seek out a diverse group of people to be in my stories, and lots of times it can be incredibly frustrating because you might find the perfect person, like one of the lawyers I found who was working on the pipeline issue in North Dakota. She's a Native American woman, but she was the number 2 lawyer, and she couldn't talk. The number 1 lawyer had to, and that happened to be a white guy. And so, like, it can be end up being, because I get that sometimes it's that there really is one best person to talk to, or the only one that you can get to talk. So I think it's something for every profession to start thinking about too. Why does it have to be the number 1? Can't the number 2 also talk?
I just want to interject a quick question here. We're talking about sources. Is there anything that you find that scientists misunderstand about journalists?
that we're here to promote science instead of reporting it accurately.
So they see your job as promoting their work, not so much as reporting it. Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
Has that ever been an obstacle when you're working with these scientists?
I haven't run into where it's like a huge problem. Sometimes they want us like sort of see my story before it comes out, which we cannot do. But in that case, you can ask them like, what are your concerns? We can go over, is there like a particular concept that you think is difficult that people misunderstand a lot? I can talk through that again, but
The other thing that I find sometimes is that people think because you interviewed them or even maybe took a trip and spent time with them that you owe them a story, and that's sometimes out of your hands as a reporter, and you have to you're going to come back and the editor's going to say, no, that's boring. And you spent 2 days reporting it and it's boring. And so the scientists can be very angry when that happens, because they, of course, don't think their life's work is boring.
Yeah, I think to Francie's point, sometimes scientists want you to promote their story, and they want you to promote it in a certain way, and then they're like, why did you speak to that guy that I hate? And I think you should take out everything that he said, and you just have to be like, that's your debate to handle. Like, I told a balanced story, and I'm kind of sticking by it.
Yes.
Hi, I wanted to ask a question about another obstacle that faces a lot of reporters in all areas, but I think especially in science, and I wonder if you've ever faced this. Have you ever had pressure within your organization or or your media, whoever you're working for, because of their sponsors or advertisers? Say you're writing something about pollution, and GE is a big advertiser or something like that. Have you ever faced that or had colleagues who have had that happen?
I mean, at NewsHour, you know, because we're public media, most of our support comes from foundations.
Okay.
Viewers and viewers and viewers. Like, yeah. No, it's never come up. I mean, if we have to cover the NSF, you know, we'll declare it. But if we're covering them in a negative light, then it's just, or there's just like a negative aspect of the story, we'll just report it. I mean, I did a story last year about 23andMe and how white supremacists use their platform to sort of prove that they're white, and 23andMe wrote to me. 23andMe was a sponsor, is a sponsor. I'm not sure. I know at some point they were giving us support, and you know, 23andMe reached out to me and they were like, you know, we disagree with some aspects of the story, and I just wrote them back a long explanation about why we reported things the way we did, and we didn't change the story. So it's kind of how it goes sometimes.
I had a situation when I was at High Country News where a very large donor of our organization, a very large donor, like a big chunk of our income, became part of one of my stories. And I was so proud of the little organization because it happened to be that the editor of my magazine piece was also the publisher of my of the whole thing, and so I brought the issue to him and I said, you know, I think we have to write about this, and or maybe I said something less. I shouldn't brag on myself. Maybe I said, you know, look, what do we do about this? And he said, well, if it's part of the story, it needs to be part of the story. And we didn't attack the foundation, but just the fact that we wrote about them in a way that was not positive, maybe just coincidentally, we lost the funding, which was a huge chunk of change. Mm-hmm. It's a reality of journalism these days, and it's not pretty. You know, I would say, yeah, it's a huge blow when a big chunk of change goes away. But I'm very proud of High Country News.
I personally have not run into this.
I'm sorry?
I personally have not run into this.
That's good to hear. I mean, we like that you haven't. Cindy?
When you're interviewing for a story that's going to be in video or audio format, do you have sometimes the experience of a scientist just using really long sentences or language that you just know you're not going to use because it's not appropriate for those formats? And if this comes up for you, do you coach the scientist in how they might rephrase that in a way that you can use it? And if you do or don't, do you have ethical qualms about doing that?
No, I mean, when we set up for broadcast interviews, I typically tell scientists and their press people two things. One is that, you know, they should think of our audience as a science-minded 15-year-old, you know, somebody who may not understand all of the technical jargon, but has like sort of a sense of how science works. Normally that puts them in a pretty good mindset. The other thing I tell folks is like, you know, have your analogies ready. I think, you know, scientists at times get really mad at journalists if you use an analogy that they find inaccurate. So I say, like, you know, come up with your analogies before we get there. If I feel that, you know, a scientist goes on a really long-winded discussion, normally that just means that they won't be included in the piece, or that they'll be included in a very short bit, and then it'll be up to me to use my stand-ups or like my on-camera time to explain things and put things into context.
From working at NPR a long time, and now going back on the radio, it's huge, this very issue that you're talking about. And I would say that my coaching was not as respectful as yours. Like, I mean, I would say, you know, so I would tell people to begin with, you know, just imagine you're at a barbecue and you're trying to make your story sound interesting, your research sound interesting, and also understandable to the person who just happens to be standing next to you. Or imagine, you know, you're trying to explain your research to a 5th grader, not a 15-year-old. I mean, and often I would have to break in on the interview and just say, stop. I don't understand anything you're saying, and let's start again and try again. And I mean, I would always try to be respectful and never but it can be very, very difficult to explain science. And I would rather have them explaining it and interpreting it into common language rather than me, because they know their research better. So I think it's if scientists, and also, by the way, there are usually real words that describe your research, and you might like those fancy words better, but usually there are real words. And I know some amazing, amazing scientists who are incredible at communicating their research in very plain English. So you can usually do it. So I think it's kind of, if researchers want to be famous, they should work on it. It's not easy. I mean, I think there are some scientists I've talked to who just couldn't. In the end, they couldn't explain it in a way that made sense to anybody but them and their 17 colleagues who are up to date on their research. And I don't think it's ethically a problem at all. I think it's to try to make a scientist explain their research in every man, every woman English.
Okay. Here we go.
I just wanted to say a quick plug. CCON mentioned a couple places to look for diverse sources, and I also wanted to say there's a website called Women Also Know. That is for women political scientists, and there's sort of check marks on yes, they'll do media, yes, they'll do on air, they've done media, et cetera. That's all. Just wanted to make that plug.
All right, we've got a question back here. We're just going to get.
Hi. So I just have a question regarding, I know we've talked a lot about how science articles can get polarized or misunderstood by audiences, and as your role, it's not necessarily your job to worry about that. You just need to get the truth, and I think you guys reiterated that really well. But I was wondering, in this day and age, where your impact is so quantifiable now, you can see your shares, you can see how it's comments on your stories and things like that. Has that encouraged you, discouraged you, or do you just try to not look at that whatsoever and just report what you do?
At Pacific Standard, the writers, we don't see those stats very much at all, which I think is a great practice. I don't know if it is feasible at every publication. But yeah, it is a huge relief. I thank you to my editors who deal with the numbers directly. Yeah.
Anybody else?
Yeah,
how much you pay attention to that?
At NewsHour, we're kind of constantly paying attention to the stats, even though we're not really based on we're not based on ads. Like, there's really no reason for us to care so much about it. But I love it. I think it's really important to understand where your story is going, who's reading your story. I'll often look at the demographics to see, which part of the country is checking out a certain story. Is it men, women? Is it what age groups? I think one thing that we're doing a lot of these days is we're trying to put stories out on a lot of different platforms. So Apple News, Flipboard, and trying to really figure out, what works in each of those spaces. And I mean, I know it can be, it's like if you have a story that does do well and goes viral, it can be a little bit addicting to try to chase that. But a lot of the reasons why a story will go viral are often out of your hands. Maybe Google decided to feature your story this day. And I think once you realize how the mechanics work, you kind of stop worrying about it, and you just kind of worry about doing a strong story and then maybe working on individual things that might get the story to do better on Flipboard versus Apple News versus Google News. And that's actually kind of what our study is looking at right now that I mentioned earlier.
You've got the mic, take it.
Are there any areas of science that you feel have been undercovered or that you would like to see more reporting on?
Math. Math. I think there needs to be more reporting about math. I think Quanta does a really good job of covering it, but you really need specialists to do it, and there aren't a whole lot of math reporters out there. So if anybody's an educator out here, if you can
Will y'all help me thank this incredible panel? And I also want to thank Sage.